What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Julio G TV. Today, we got another episode of The Decree. Remember, that's the show where I bring you the latest, either from a local, national, or global standpoint, with a focus on the legal aspects, but with the overall goal of uncovering the truth. Today, we got another guest segment, but as you guys know, we are doing a piece with the guests on the election. So today we're talking international and foreign affairs or geopolitics, wars, things of that nature. And we got a really great guest in store for you to help us get some more information primarily, so that way you're more informed and we can help you make a decision. So our guest today is, I actually met him through the gym. And, fellow gym rat, and we've stayed in touch. He's doing some great things on social media, things of that nature. And so he goes by the name Aiden on X. He's a war and geopolitical commentator who strives to bring the truth on complex foreign policy issues to English-speaking audiences. You can also find him on YouTube on the channel Calibrated, where he breaks down these important issues for his audience and, of course, the world. His content is untouched by outside money and bias, making it a rarity, and it's contrasting narratives driven by the MSM news outlets, which is really important because we need to bring you guys, like I mentioned, the information that you need to make wise, informed, logical decisions. And so, without further ado, his name, Scottson Sterritt. Thanks for being on the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. So we're here to talk, international foreign affairs. We're here to help the, audience make a more informed decision with the information you got. I know on your channel, that's primarily what you're talking about, focusing on some of the things that are going on overseas, things of that nature. So I think, the reason I wanted to bring you on is for that expertise, but also, to tie it into the crucial time we have now, which is the election. We know some of you guys have already voted, but that's fine. I'm glad you exercised your right, but those of you that haven't voted, that's going to be some crucial information they could have to add to the other list of things that are important for voting. So
yeah, absolutely.
We could just go ahead and jump right in. I want to talk about, speaking of voting and the election, why we're seeing so much more activity in the Biden-Harris administration versus, the Trump-Pence administration. And, I could just leave it open-ended to that to see where you'd want to steer it. But, why do you think the activity picked up? Do you think it was bound to happen? Was it anything Trump did? Or was it anything Biden-Harris administration did?
So are you referring to wars and stuff like that?
Yeah, wars, the Ukraine war, everything going on in the Middle East with Isreal and all of that. And then we could also get into, Russia and China and things of that nature. But, why do you think the activity picked up?
Yeah, so this is it's a very good question, actually. If you look back to, in particular, with regards to Ukraine, we'll start with Ukraine because that's sort of my area of expertise, right? That's where I primarily focus. That's where I do a lot of my coverage of the war and stuff.
Right.
In terms of Ukraine, this has been an ongoing issue since 2008, realistically, when the West said that Ukraine was going to join NATO. They made a very clear statement, and that is a Russian red line. So that happened during the Bush administration.
Right.
It carried over into the Obama administration. In 2014, we saw the overthrow of the Ukrainian government and the installation of a pro-Western government.
Right.
That really heated up the issues between Russia and the United States and NATO. It continued for 8 years. There was an ongoing civil war, and that ended up leading into the open war that we see now between Russia and Ukraine, which is technically a proxy of NATO. We fully support and fund them.
Right.
In terms of the increase, it's not so much an increase in a difference between Republicans and Democrats. Really, the change is you have establishment politicians and an anti-establishment politician. So when Trump was in office, he did not go along with the Ukraine project in the same way. I think this war in Ukraine was supposed to start a long time ago, during the Hillary Clinton administration.
Makes sense.
But as we saw, that wasn't what ended up happening. And everybody in the establishment thought Hillary Clinton was going to win.
Right.
And what we saw over the next 4 years was an anti-establishment individual fighting the establishment the whole way through. It's why Trump didn't get a lot done during his presidency, but we saw a real halt to all of the foreign policy projects that the United States had been working on, particularly Ukraine, Taiwan, and some of the Middle East stuff. Although the Middle East stuff had really slowed down, the U.S. was just getting to the point where we were pulling out of the Middle East almost entirely. You know, we left Afghanistan in 2020. That was a disaster. But we still pulled out. It was a disaster for us to stay and continue the nation building operation that we were undertaking there. Same goes for Iraq. We're supposed to leave Iraq by 2026 now. That is an agreement we've made with the Iraqi government. So the Middle East was really slowing down. But as soon as Trump was out of office and Biden came back in, the establishment was back in play, right? You didn't have people, it's like you have yes men and no men, right? And the yes men are back in office. So
I like that.
So when it comes to any sort of foreign policy issue, the Biden administration goes right along with the narrative, right?
Right.
And the Trump administration just didn't do that as much. So we saw a lot less productivity from the Trump administration, but we also saw a lot less foreign wars and foreign interventions and economic issues because the Trump administration was focused on making deals.
Right.
And those deals are sometimes not always the most beneficial, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that Trump is making the best deals all over the place, and some of his ideas when it comes to tariffs and stuff, I don't know how successful those are going to be, his economic policies, but in the long term at least.
Right.
But in terms of communication, the Biden administration doesn't talk to Putin. Putin is a leader of a nuclear power, right?
Yeah.
He is somebody you have to do diplomacy with, whether you like him or not.
Right.
Right. Same goes for Xi Jinping. Same goes for all of these leaders. And the Biden administration has no interest in diplomacy.
And do you think, I think you bring up a good topic there. Do you think that Trump's ability to communicate with these world leaders is something that we need in a president, as opposed to, we could just do this proxy war, we could operate through, these other industries, whatever it may be? Yeah,
I think that I wouldn't say necessarily that he can talk to people. He can deal, right? He can sit at a table and negotiate and get really good negotiating terms and make negotiating terms that are mutually beneficial for the people across the table as well. Right. So, it might not be a win-win, but it's not a lose-lose or a lose-win for one side. Both sides come out, the other side benefiting. Right. This is what we saw from the Trump campaign or the Trump administration with the improvement of relations with North Korea. Right. North Korea, the issue is just so ridiculous. It's a war that happened 70 years ago. It hasn't stopped. And the reason why we've never settled it is because we want South Korea on our side. Right. We want South Korea to be a place that we can stage U.S. troops and assets to keep an eye on China. And China likes North Korea as well because they have a reason to, basically. So
it's kind of vice versa with them.
And it's almost a mutually beneficial thing. And what Trump came in and did was ended all of that. Right. And ended the U.S.'s obligation, I guess you would say, to have a presence on the DMZ in South Korea 70 years after that war ended. Right. And what happened immediately after the Trump administration got out? The Biden administration collapsed those relationships with North Korea, which we don't need North Korea, right? Yeah. But opening the door means that you potentially remove a major issue for the world, right? Yeah. That war, you have a North Korea that is a nuclear state. So that's just one example of how the Trump administration dealt instead of escalated, which is what the Biden administration does. The Biden administration, I always say they're like neocons or neolibs, right? All they do is push wars, push foreign wars, because it makes them money.
Right.
The Democratic Party is now the warmongering party. It used to be the Republicans, right?
And you hear RFK saying that, you know, most recently, you know, last 3-4 months.
And it's wild because the base seems to go along with it as well, which has never been a Democrat position.
100%.
They've always been anti-war.
Right.
I mean, they were the ones that were out protesting the Vietnam War.
Right.
You know, they were calling those guys coming back baby killers.
Yep.
Which is crazy. And I know it's a different generation and it's a different Democrat Party now, but that's part of the issue, right? Is it's not really the Democrat Party anymore. It swings back and forth and back and forth. And now they are more of what the early 2000s GOP was, where it's heavily about the military-industrial complex, and that's the Democrat Party we have today.
That makes sense. And I mean, it from a, you know, national perspective to be able to, like you said, you know, make these deals, you know, it seems to me that you're either going to be doing that, or like you mentioned, you're either going to be doing what the current administration is doing and, you know, go along with whatever the, you know, military industrial complex, for example, wants.
Sure.
Do you think, you know, you said one administration was establishment, the other was somewhat non-establishment.
Yeah.
And how would you define that? I mean, because I know a lot of folks throw that around a little bit, but how would you define one being establishment and one being non-establishment?
The difference is that the Trump administration, at least in some aspects, right?
Yeah.
In some aspects, they are establishment.
Right.
Like when it comes to Israel, whether you vote for Trump or you vote for Kamala, nothing is going to change with our foreign policy in the direction of Israel.
That makes sense.
That's not going to change. That is a permanent establishment. Most foreign policy in general doesn't really change because the U.S. has geostrategic interests that it has to maintain, right? That's the bottom line. And if any party loses those, it's going to be a horrible just implication for that party, right?
Yeah.
In terms of your next election cycle, all of that. So when I say anti-establishment, I mean that there is a permanent establishment in the United States that is, in my opinion, controlled by lobbies.
Right.
And if you are an establishment individual, you go along with that because it's really good for your political career.
Right.
And as you've seen, Trump has gone against that sort of establishment idea. He wants to do his own things, which I think is awesome. If you vote for somebody, they should want to do their own things. They shouldn't lie to you, get in, and do something completely different.
100%.
But when you're anti-establishment, the establishment works tirelessly to make sure that you don't get anything done.
That makes sense.
And as we saw, what did we have? Russian interference, Russiagate, that whole dossier, completely fake. It was completely fake.
With the intention of
discrediting him and making it seem like the Russians had interfered and that he was being backed by the Russians. It makes him a foreign agent, basically, right? None of that was real.
Yeah.
And we've seen this time and time again where they, you know, whether it's judicial or, you know, whatever, they're trying to prevent him from being able to run. Mm-hmm. And even during when he was in office, what did we see the whole time? Well, just take his border wall, for example, right? He asked for $5 billion for a border wall. That's nothing. It's literally nothing for the U.S. budget. Yeah. He was completely stonewalled for 4 years on that project.
Right.
And that is just one example of multiple projects. Everything he did, you look at the mainstream media, they're always coming after him. That's what anti-establishment means. When you have the entire system working to get you either out or unable to get anything done, that's what I would consider to be anti-establishment. You're going against the system, not necessarily even in a good way.
Yeah. Completely.
Yeah, or completely.
You got to fall in line
but,
with some...
But you don't follow the big tenets of what they want, what they see, what they think needs to happen geostrategically, or even domestically. And so they're going to work tirelessly to make sure that we saw it in Colorado. You don't get on ballots. Yeah. We saw it with the judicial system. He has 40 felonies, which is perfectly fine. Yeah. He committed business crimes, right? Yeah. They didn't affect anybody. They literally didn't hurt anybody. Yeah. He lied about some of his property values to get better loans. And
I think there's a lot of
the banks approved of it.
Yeah.
He approved of it. Nobody lost anybody. No, there was no fraud committed. There was nothing so, if you look into any politician's background, you're going to see financial crimes. Absolutely. You're probably going to see bribery.
Or something.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at Eric Adams, the New York mayor.
Right.
He just got caught with multiple foreign bribery charges.
Not reporting the contributions.
Crazy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and dinners and private flights all over the world, all sorts of stuff.
Right.
But this is just politics, right? So that's anti-establishment. That they will work tirelessly to make sure that you are discredited and, not able to do anything within the system.
Right. And I think that's important to mention that because, to some extent, there's this line where you have to ride essentially as a politician.
Yeah.
But, you kind of want to do your thing over here, say, Republican side, and then Democrats kind of want to do their thing over here.
Yeah.
And whether one side or the other is more aligned with, the military industrial complex, things of that nature, you might find one leaning more towards that side. Okay. And that's kind of what we're seeing with, the Ukraine war ramping up a little bit, things of that nature. Okay. And, well, I think that's a good segue. Well, let me ask you this. Do you think there's any other important factor as opposed to, establishment, non-establishment for the increase in activity?
I think that the global economy is in a much worse position. Following COVID, we never really recovered.
Right.
The economy is in a bad position, and the way I see it is really what we're looking at is sort of a 1913-esque world, right? If you know what happened in 1914, World War I began.
Yeah.
One of the most catastrophic events in human history.
Right.
Nobody wanted it. It was not a war of ethics.
Yeah.
It was like World War II. You could say, "Oh, we're going to stop, fascists."
Right. Any necessity.
And we didn't really know about the Holocaust at the time, but also we went in there and we prevented a genocide from happening against the Jewish population, right? So at least there was some moralistic principles, and we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, this, that, and the other.
Yeah, let's make the world a better place sort of thing.
World War I started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Right. And it involved Germany as one of the main players, and Germany had nothing to do with the war and didn't want any aspect of it. And they ended up losing the war, right? Because they were just aligned with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yeah. So that's sort of the situation I see us in. You have, large corporations, which was a huge driving factor in the 1914s. It was right after the Industrial Revolution, especially in Europe. And you had this very rapidly changing world, which we have today, 100%. Right?
Yep,
this is something, this is something about humans is it took us like 50,000 years to go from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, right? It took us 10,000 years to go from agricultural to metropolis cities, right? Yep. Like the Roman Empire, stuff like that. These mega cities where you don't have to grow your own food because you have an economy and you have jobs and stratification. Yeah. And then you go to, anyway, getting back to it, the increase in change comes from a multitude of factors, right? And we're progressing so fast technologically now that we're not able to keep up with the world that we're living in. Got it. Right? We went from planes in 1920 to landing on the moon in 1960. Right. That's when you update a system like that, it runs into problems. We're advancing and we don't know how to control what we're capable of. Right? That's part of the issue. So there's the economic side of it. There's the unknown that we're entering into constantly with different weapon systems, with different technologies, AI, all of this stuff, right? We don't know what it's going to do. We don't know how to control it. Right. We can be manipulated by it and we don't even know. So that's true. That's part of it, right? Yeah. Also, globalization has changed everything. But really, I think the increase in activity comes from the fact that every country around the world knows that some sort of issue is coming, right? Okay. Just like in 1914. Right. The world economies were running too hot. Everybody was jockeying for position. And the war broke out, not out of necessity, but out of friction, right? Yeah. It just was a tinderbox and it just lit and everybody was willing to fight. Nobody was ready to back down. That's exactly how I see it today. You have China, Russia, Iran, America, NATO, right? Yeah. Nobody's backing down.
Right.
Israel, Iran, nobody's backing down. Everybody wants the fight. And that's sort of I think just the position that the globe is in right now is that everybody is willing to fight.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous because when you have nobody backing down, that's when you get into a global conflict.
That makes sense. And do you think, I think you mentioned a good point there in terms of, the willingness of, this person to intervene or that country to intervene or, this leader willing to intervene.
Yeah.
Where does that take us? Let's assume the administration changes. Do you think this, activity will continue? And we'll get into some of the more particulars of what I'm mentioning by activity. But do you think it's going to continue? Do you think, let's say Trump gets in, do you think he's going to try and halt it? And the reason I ask that is because, generally you see on social media, you see, maybe you're talking to your neighbor, or, you don't see eye to eye ideology, politically, whatever. People will generalize and they'll just say, well, Trump didn't start any wars. Well, you started some wars, So, I mean, do you think, how would you break that down? I mean, how much truth is there to that? I mean, is there any, truth to any of that? I mean,
yeah. So when it comes to foreign policy, I often always say that the permanent establishment makes the rules, right?
Got it.
So when it comes to the election, and I'm a little bit disillusioned. So maybe take what I say with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But when I look at it, I see a government that never changes. We don't have term limits for or age limits for congressional or Senate seats. So that establishment never changes. And they're the ones that make a majority of the decision. There's a reason why they talk about, controlling the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the House are the most important things, right? Like that's
especially when it comes to this funding.
Yeah. No, I mean, they make all the rules.
Yeah.
The president puts some things forward and then they vote on it. It's checks and balances, right? So the president is just an illusion of choice. Right. And they focus so much on it because that's the one where everybody thinks that they're making a big decision, but really they're making decisions about a few domestic issues, a lot of one-issue voters. That's where their thing comes in. So if you're like pro-life or pro-choice, like that, the presidential election might actually matter, right? But even then, the Supreme Court decides it.
Yeah.
So it's just this illusion of choice, and particularly when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to foreign wars.
Yeah.
When you're talking about Ukraine, anywhere. The permanent establishment, the military-industrial complex, they're the ones that are making the decisions, and you also have geostrategic interests of the United States that can't be ignored, right? If we're not number one, somebody else will be number one. Yeah. And that might not be the worst thing, right? But it also might not be the best thing.
Yeah.
And being number one is always better than being number two.
100%.
And so, when it comes to places like Israel, it doesn't matter if you vote for Kamala or Trump.
Right.
Because Israel is not a religious thing. Yeah. Like people try to make it out to be.
Right.
There is a religious aspect, obviously. They're fighting about religion over there and Holy Land and stuff like that.
We're just talking about supporting them.
Yeah, but what they are to us is a forward operating base in the Middle East.
Yeah.
They are a plausible deniability tool that we can use to attack anybody in the region, right? Why do you think they have F-35s?
Right.
They don't have an economy, right? Or their economy is so small. They have 11 million people.
Yeah.
But they have one of the strongest air forces on the planet.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Right.
Because we want them to, right? They do whatever they want, and we fund them and arm them and stand beside them, not because we like Israel so much. It's because Israel is Ukraine in Europe. Israel is Taiwan in the South China Sea. Israel is a excuse for the U.S. to be in the region. Yeah. We have to protect them, right?
Makes sense.
We have to protect them.
Right.
Even though they're the ones usually getting themselves into situations where they need protecting, right? Because they act so aggressively because they know that the U.S. is going to come and back them up at any time. Right. And it's not so much like I said, it's not a religious thing. It's not a Democrat-Republican thing. It is a U.S. interest thing.
Yeah.
And so we can't ignore those U.S. interests.
From that aspect. Yeah. I like that you caveated that. Yeah, because, I mean, we could get into a whole conversation about, the Christian
Oh yeah.
backing, all that type of stuff.
yeah.
But that's a whole nother.
And I always say this. I always say that when you're talking about the people at the top, and you might disagree, and your listeners might disagree, but I tend to think that CEOs, world leaders, religious leaders, they tend to be psychopaths. The way you get to the top of an organization, especially a very powerful organization, is you have to be ruthless, you have to be cutthroat, and you have to lack a certain amount of empathy to get a job done.
Right.
And this is not to say that only bad people make it in politics. No, but politics is dirty.
Yeah.
It's a dirty game, and you have to be willing to play
especially
it.
nowadays.
So the people who rise to the top tend to be the people,
or at least it's just more, we could see more, I should say.
The people who tend to rise to the top are the ones who are willing to get things done.
Yeah.
Right. And that usually takes a certain kind of personality.
Right.
So I try to remove all of the distractions when it comes to especially geopolitics.
Yeah.
I see religion, it's a very important thing, but
100%.
it's not a driving factor in any of these issues. The Crusades was not really about Christianity.
Yeah.
Right? It was about controlling massive amounts of territory and resources, right? And the same goes to today.
So they're just trying to get the job done, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's something that's not going to change for that aspect.
Yeah, like when you hear Biden get up there and talk about being a Catholic, I don't think.
Yeah, because he's contradicting in other areas.
and he's been pro-war since the 1980s.
Yeah.
He was talking about bombing Belgrade and in Serbia in 1990s, right? So that's not a very Catholic thing to do.
Right.
Right?
Amongst some of the other
lists.
lists.
They don't care. It's just camouflage.
Yeah.
It's just because Americans care about that stuff, right? Religion's important to some people. Right? Like depending whatever religion you are.
Right.
And it's just a way that you can be manipulated. So you have to be very, very careful about very powerful people making promises based off of lines, not even just religious, but even, like we were talking about single issue voting, like that you have to be very careful when you're hearing people make promises because they don't care about you.
Yeah.
They don't care about those things. They care about your vote. And once your vote's in, they can do whatever they want.
Do you I guess kind of reeling it back to the activity piece do you think, putting aside maybe the Israel the Taiwan all those, that we're specifically, would most likely, whatever administration we're in, we would back, it sounds like. Outside of maybe the Ukraine activity, is there anything else out there that maybe they're not seeing on CNN or Fox or, anything out there that's going on that they should be aware of that might change from one administration to another?
Yes. When it comes to the direction we're going, the Biden Kamala administration is obsessed with Russia. Okay. They have a deep, deep obsession with Russia. Trump does not.
Yeah.
So the support for Ukraine is going to drop if Trump gets in for sure.
Right.
The Biden administration and the then Kamala administration, and nothing's going to change, by the way, if you vote. If you want to vote for Kamala, you're voting for this same exact administration. There might be some little changes here and there, but the goals, the ambitions are not going to change.
And I think she said it the other day on an interview, that she wouldn't really change anything.
And she's flip-flopped so much on everything. And it's because they don't hold any particular set of values. They just are trying to get it's like an ideology. They're just trying to get the job done.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter what they have to say, what they have to do. But when it comes to, like we said, Israel, that's not going to change because that is a geostrategic issue, right? And AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, is very, very strong. And 100%. It's very strong because we want it to be very strong. Right. Because Israel's very important to the United States geostrategically. So there's not a lot that would change, but particularly with Ukraine, because
that's probably the number one
thing. It is Biden's
Yeah.
obsession. He is hand over fist obsessed with Putin, getting him out of office, all of that. Yeah. And that is not really a establishment thing as much. They would love it because the same thing happened in 1991 Russia, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, we went in, we privatized everything, and we stole a bunch of wealth from the country.
Yeah.
That we won, right? That was winning, and we kept them down for another 20 years which is really good for the United States geostrategically, because if Russia's weak, China doesn't have a strong energy partner, right? Europe does have a strong energy partner in Russia.
Right.
And we can really control the board. But now we failed. Russia and China are like this, right? And and we know we can't win. The Pentagon is like usually the sane voice in the room because they're like the military analysis.
Yeah.
And they come and they say, we can't keep doing this. They're the least political organization.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and they're the ones who always come out and tell the truth. And they have been raising the red flag about Ukraine for years, like a year almost now, about the situation and how it's developing. And so I think that would be pretty much the only difference.
One of the things.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue into Ukraine. Is there an end in sight? Whether it sounds like under Harris administration that would continue.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe that would leave us if Trump gets in. Is there an end in sight?
So it's hard to say
because
at this point, I don't think it really has anything to do with the U.S.
Okay.
It does. I mean, the war is going to continue in the same way it is continuing right now, but the issues that Ukraine militarily are experiencing economically, demographically, are untenable.
Yeah.
Right. There's no coming back from the current situation that they're in.
Right.
They've lost something like 9 million people to not to the war, just to people leaving into Europe.
Just in general.
Yeah, they left. Some of people left into Russia. Like some 1.5 million people went into Russia from Ukraine, and then like 6 million went into Europe, and then they've lost probably something around a million in terms of battlefield casualties, and not killed, all killed, just injured and killed in action, which usually takes them out of the economy.
Right.
So that's what you would consider like population loss.
Yeah.
Militarily, they're losing horribly right now. We're not providing them with even a quarter of what they need. We give them just enough to stay in the fight because the continuation of the war, we see it as a way to continue to degrade Russia, which it's not really happening in that way anymore.
Yeah.
Russia is on a full military footing now. Their economy is set up. They're not going to lose this war.
Yeah.
It's actually turning into an industrial meat grinder for the Ukrainians, where they are forced to basically conscript people off the streets. If you go and look at my Telegram or Twitter, you can see these videos. I'm not making this up. They literally pull people. They gang them into vans, basically. They grab them, pull them in, put them into vans, send them to prisons, basically, where they can't leave. They're given very limited training and then sent immediately to the front. And that's the situation for Ukraine right now. And it's not tenable.
Yeah.
They've already sacrificed basically.
That's how desperate they are.
Yeah, they've already sacrificed their entire economy. And it's not even what the Ukrainian people want anymore. Right. The Ukrainian government is no longer representative of the people at all. Basically, since the war started, it hasn't been. Yeah. But now it's getting to the point where the Ukrainian people are starting to get disillusioned because in the beginning they were rah, we're going to beat the Russians. Right. Ridiculous statement from the beginning. You're talking about a country with 180 million people versus a country with 40 million max. Yeah. But, they thought that if NATO backed them up, they would be able to do something. Right. Now we're entering a very dangerous phase where the Zelensky regime, is doing everything in their power to stay in control. They're arresting any journalists that say anything negative. They've done that the entire war. People often look at Russia and say, "Oh, Russia's like this horrible." Ukraine is arguably worse. Yeah, right? How could you say that about Putin? You're his friend. Yada yada. More corrupt. Ukraine has always been more corrupt. Has always had the same, if not greater, issues that the Russian population has in terms of censorship. In terms of if you something interesting is really, if you want to know, in 2023, I think 3,400 people in Britain were arrested for what they posted online. No kidding. Yeah. In Russia, 400 people were. So that's sort of the difference. And this is sort of the propaganda thing where we make these countries seem like destitute pits, right? Yeah. Of censorship and it's a dictatorship and everything's bad. And
in terms of Russia.
Yeah. But then, and then they go and they give a completely antithesis narrative for Ukraine, which is the neighbor. Yeah. It was Russia 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? It was the Soviet
Union. I think you bring up a good point. I mean, I'm not sure if I got the paraphrase 100% correct, but when Tucker Carlson went over, he said, in which he got a lot of backlash for. Yeah. He said,
that's anti-establishment. That's anti-narrative, right? Yeah. So you're going against mainstream media. You're going against the narrative. Yeah. Continue.
Yeah. No, he just said, this is what I remember, our streets looked like. It was clean. Yep. There was no, homelessness, all that other type of stuff. So, and I think that's a important point because, if firsthand experience defeats, anything. Yeah. You're there, you witness it. He was there, he witnessed it. Yep. Regardless if you're in that, country that we've cast that shadow upon, of course, we're not saying that they're the best either, but they're not what most are saying.
And that's the thing about Putin is I'm sort of like a Putin fanboy. Like I've followed him since, I've not followed him, but I've, followed his actions, what he's done. I've been reporting. I've been following.
You've nerded out on it.
Yeah, I've been following the Ukraine conflict since 2013, right? Like since it started. That, and I'm 26 now, so I was in high school when I started watching this stuff. I was a dork. I was just interested in geopolitics and stuff. And Putin.
No, we need more people like that.
Putin is a actual politician. A real politician.
You saw in the Tucker interview, to bring it right back.
He cares about Russia. Mm-hmm. And you can say that he's, I think that he's probably a psychopath, just like anybody else who rises to the top. But the thing about Putin is he has nationalistic interests in mind. He cares, and this is a thing about dictators too. He is elected, but there's no elections in Russia really. There's the opposition gets 5% at the most in any given election, so it's not like he gets 80-something% of the vote.
He's not worried about it.
But he's also very popular. Right. So this is the thing is they talk about he's a dictator. The elections aren't fair. Yeah, that's totally true.
Right.
But even according to third-party outside poll of the Russian population, something like 76% of the population approves of what Putin is doing.
Wow.
The thing about dictators is...
So it's not like they feel oppressed.
This is the thing. Way. So when you live in a democracy, it's 50-50 and nobody's ever happy.
Yeah.
Right? And at least in the democracy or the republic we live in. Right? In Russia, if he drops below 60% approval rating, he's going to be thrown out of office.
Yeah.
This is the thing that people don't understand about dictators is they have to be popular.
Yeah.
Whether it's because they're,
forcing it or
whatever. And the thing is he's not. The reason why Russia isn't having an issue getting men to sign up for the military to go fight in Ukraine is because they understand that this is an existential issue for Russia. Right? The Russian economy has improved since this war has started, which is wild because we leveled sanctions against them, right?
Yep.
But the thing is we leveled sanctions against them in 2014.
Right.
And there were little sanctions, and they saw how much damage it did.
Yeah.
And so then they changed their economy, made themselves self-sufficient and insulated so that they could never be controlled by the West again. Mm-hmm. And that's what the U.S. is strong in, right? Yeah. We have an okay military.
Right.
We have a really good military if the enemy doesn't have air defense.
Right.
Because we can fly planes and drop bombs on whoever we want, and we can control the skies. That's what all of our aircraft carriers are good for.
Yeah.
But when you're going up against a near peer, somebody who has nuclear weapons, somebody who has the ability to sink your aircraft carriers, somebody who has the ability to win a ground war against you, because the U.S. military is not designed for a ground war. Yeah. We're not the World War II U.S. military anymore. We're a global war on terror. So we're hyper specialized. Think about it. The Russians are using machine guns, and the Ukrainians and the U.S. uses sniper rifles, right? So everything that the U.S. does is hyper precise and meant to accomplish a task, whereas the Russians have an army that they can send in a direction, and it might not be the most accurate and the most efficient, technologically advanced, but it gets the job done. You have to have 1 million men if you want to go fight a real war.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas the U.S. has 70,000 in our armed forces combined. It's like nothing.
Yeah,
So,
that's nothing.
Yeah. Well,
Especially
it might be more than that, but in terms of active, ready to go combat units, that's sort of what it is. We have a lot of reserves and stuff.
I think even just in comparison to the population, it's very small.
Oh yeah. And it's radically impressive when you look at the budget.
Yeah.
You're talking close to $900 billion.
Right.
And we have a smaller military than Russia in terms of its, human population.
Right.
and you want to talk about wasted money, and we talked about this a little bit before, but the U.S. military has an officer corps that's like 5 times the size of Russia's officer corps, but they have, what, 5 times less people in the military. So they're it's again this like bureaucracy where it's not designed to be a military. It's a peacetime army. We haven't fought a real war since World War II.
Yeah,
Vietnam Korea was a police action. The Vietnam War was still nothing really that massive.
You're right.
No war we've fought since World War II has been like that, and so we don't need that army. Right? We control everybody with our.
We were established at that point.
Yeah, well, we control everybody with our economy.
Yeah.
Right? We have the petrodollar. We have the prime currency. We have the fiat of currencies of the world.
We have the ultimate weapon.
So what do we do? What do we do when somebody gets out of line? We say, oh, we're worried about your humanitarian situation in your country. We think that there's a civilian crisis. We're worried about the conditions. And we say, we're going to pull funding if you don't do what we say.
Right.
And countries do what we say. But that's shifting now, right? This is the whole idea behind multipolarity. So the U.S. has lost its economic weapon that we tried to use against Russia. Yeah. And now the Russian economy is becoming immensely strong. Their military is completely different from what it was in 2022.
Right.
Russia had the same military that we had in 2022. A degraded peacetime military that's not built to fight.
Yeah.
Now the Russian military has gone through all of its bloody lessons in modern warfare. Its officer corps is now the most experienced in the world because they've been in action for close to 3 years.
Right.
Right? Its army is the most experienced army in the world. We have created the exact beast that we set out to prevent in Ukraine.
By supporting this effort.
We created a monster. And if you're a politician, you could say, that's a good thing. We have a boogeyman.
Right.
We lost
we
the
have
Soviet,
a reason now.
We lost the Soviet Union, and we had to create boogeymen.
Right.
Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, but he was stability. Mm-hmm. We got him out, and what ended up coming out of that?
Right.
ISIS. Right? A huge vacuum opened up, a power vacuum. Yep. And something worse often fills that power vacuum when it's created. Right. So this is the problem with going and overthrowing governments. Yeah. Is you usually install something worse, and it's not efficient or effective for the population. It's not promoted by the population, and it doesn't work out.
And do you think that was, to put it, theoretically put a picture in people's head out there, do you think that was on the whiteboard when they were drawing up the support for Ukraine?
The boogeyman?
Creating the boogeyman, yeah.
So this is I don't really think they have plan Bs.
Okay.
That's why you don't see them backing down. That's why you don't see them having, they don't even come to negotiations. The Russians and the Ukrainians in March and April of 2022 were this close to getting a peace deal in Istanbul. It was called the Istanbul Agreements. Yeah. The Russians were meeting in Turkey, who was the third-party negotiator. They were this close to the deal. We sent over Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of Britain. And he offered them a deal. He said, if you turn down this negotiation and keep fighting, we will supply you with every single thing you need to beat the Russians. A lie.
And we'll let you in NATO.
A clear lie. A clear lie for a number of reasons. One, we don't have that.
Yeah.
We don't have that, what we needed.
Right.
Another thing, we thought these sanctions were going to end up doing damage eventually, and we could win that way. So we didn't, it was never about Ukraine winning militarily. Never going to happen, unless a complete Russian collapse happened.
I see what you're saying.
But that ended up being very clear very quickly. That wasn't going to happen. So, the whole idea of creating a boogeyman is always there. There's always that to fall back on, right? Worst case scenario, we have a forever enemy that we can go fight.
Right.
That's the best. That was what the Soviet Union was. It gave us 60 years of be careful of those Reds over there, right? They're coming to get you. That's what you talked about. That's that unifying sort of thing that brings people together. We had a common enemy.
Right.
The American population was so worried about communism for 1945 until the 80s, basically, that united us and kept us focused. And that's why you saw one of the greatest explosions of American culture.
American dream.
Yeah, everything. The nuclear family was so strong. Everything was set because we won the war. We were coming into our hegemony, and we had a common goal. Right. After that, since 1991, we've been kind of lost. The global war on terror was supposed to be that common goal. Next thing. But it really just divided us.
Right.
And now I think that they're sort of switching away in we don't need to be united anymore. It's better for them if we're divided. If I'm arguing with you about a woman's right to have an abortion, or black men being killed by cops or something like that, if we're arguing about that, we're not worried about Ukraine. We're not worried about that $300 billion that was just printed from nothing and sent over there and achieved nothing. We're not worried about the hundreds of billions that go to Isreal, right?
Yep.
We're more concerned about what's going on. And if we're fighting each other, we can never focus on what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's part of the goal now, I think.
And I think that's an important issue to bring up, because what if we do get to a point where we do need manpower? Yeah. You know what I mean? We need people, whether we have the, highest level of technology, whether it's even AI, whatever it may be, we need bodies eventually. And, if we're too busy here, not building that up, I know a lot of folks out there are against, increasing funding for military, all that type of stuff. And I think, that's another kind of subsidiary long-term, greater vision that, we're already so small. Yeah. We're too busy, fighting each other, and we can't prepare to, fight the boogeyman out there, so to speak. I think that's another consequence of that. But I want to touch on something you mentioned, because I think it's very important for everyone out there to hear, is in supporting Ukraine, and we talked about this earlier, the funds that were sent, what's been has it made a difference? I'm hearing that it kind of hasn't. It's just prolonged it. Yeah. But eventually, at the end of the day, it's not really going to, make a difference.
So, a lot of people look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a failure for Russia. This was sort of the idea that was pushed, because for, the General Mark Milley, who was a part of the Biden administration for a little bit. Yeah. And it was in the Pentagon. He came out and said before the Russian invasion that the Russians were going to reach Kiev in 3 days.
Oh, yes.
3 days to Kiev.
Yes. Yep.
This somehow became a Russian objective, that this was what the Russians wanted to do. They wanted to reach Kiev in 3 days. It's this weird propaganda machine that the Russians never really say anything. They never really say what they want. They maintain strategic ambiguity. They had ideas and goals, but the primary goal of the Russian military when they entered Ukraine was to scare the shit out of the Ukrainian government and force them into negotiations. Right. That's why the Russians went in with 180,000 men against a Ukrainian force of 500,000, with reserves being pulled up actively. So close to 1 million man army after 6 months. Sheesh. Right. The Russians went in with 180,000 men. Yeah. So already you're not going to conquer all of Ukraine. When they pushed down to Kiev, they went with 40,000 men. The city has 1.5 million people in it. You're never going to control any amount of territory or be able to force anything with that amount of men. The goal was to go in with a small force, force negotiations, get a peace agreement, get NATO neutrality agreed by Ukraine, and then pull out. Right. War is not good for people. Yeah. War is not good for Putin, right? It almost could have cost him his position, right? And if the economy would have been hit harder, it would have been horrible for him. Everybody makes it look like this is a war of aggression by Russia into Ukraine, right? And what it really is a very defensive, like, you got to think about Russia as a defensive animal, right? They're not as strong as they were when they were the Soviet Union, not near as strong. And they're not a threat to the United States. The only reason they invaded Ukraine is because Ukraine ended up trying to join
Join
NATO.
NATO, yep.
And that is an existential threat to Russia for a number of reasons. Economically, it suffocates them. They lose, I mean, there's Russian pipelines that run through Ukraine. If those get under NATO control, they're going to be able to control the Russian economy in terms of the
Right.
oil to Europe. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also the aspect of Western missile systems being planted in Ukraine.
Right.
And that is the Cuban Missile
right
Crisis.
next door, yeah.
It's the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
It's what the Russians are going through is literally the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States. So they went in at the absolute worst time. They went in February, late February,
Yeah.
which is the muddy season in Ukraine.
Right.
And if anybody is a fan of World War II history, you would know that Ukraine has 10 feet of black topsoil that makes movement in vehicles incredibly difficult. And there are no roads in Ukraine. It's all farmland. Right? So going in at that time is the worst. If you're going to invade aggressively to accomplish something, you go in at the end of the muddy season, either November when the
Right.
ground freezes
Right.
and through the winter, or
After
when the
it's
summer
dried up,
when the
yeah.
summer starts, right? So there's like 2 muddy seasons in Ukraine in the spring and the fall.
Yeah.
You want to avoid those. The Russians went in right at that time. Why would they do that? It makes no logical sense. It's because they had no choice. They
Yeah.
had to go in. It was a do or die moment
Yeah.
where they were about to lose their geostrategic grip on Ukraine permanently. And that's on their border. And they're losing that to
Yeah.
the United States that is 8,000 miles away.
Right.
Like what? What is that?
And do you think that's the main reason they did because of the whole NATO? That's
Oh yeah,
primarily
oh yeah. I mean,
yeah.
if you listen to Putin, just listen to Putin,
Yeah.
guys. If this is the thing is, you will only ever hear, and this is why part of my thing is bringing this information to a Western audience,
Right.
Because when you listen to the way they talk about Putin and the way Putin talks, you would think all he's doing is threatening everybody with nukes.
Yeah, killing everybody, wanting to take over.
He's a genocidal dictator.
He has an evil laugh.
If you listen
Yeah.
to him talk, it's funny too, because he was the most pro-European Russian leader he's from St. Petersburg. He
Yeah.
thinks of himself as European more than probably Russian, honestly. He's Russian European, not Russian, and then like Europe is. So he tried to join NATO in 2000. We laughed at him.
Yep.
Why? We could have got him into NATO. You know why? Because NATO has to have a reason to exist. There's no reason for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to exist if there is no boogeyman.
Yeah.
Russia is that boogeyman. It's the reason why our military-industrial complex pumps money into these countries. If you want to, you hear a lot of people talk about why Europe is so has such high quality of living standards, right? It's because they don't have a military budget. The U.S. covers their military budget. That's what NATO is. That's why Trump was threatening to pull out, is because these countries weren't meeting their 2% GDP requirements for their military, and the U.S. was covering all of that.
Which makes sense.
It's really good for the military-industrial complex, right?
Yeah.
Pumps a bunch more money into our economy, but it's not. It doesn't make sense from a logical standpoint.
Yeah.
Why do we need NATO? NATO shouldn't exist. The Soviet Union's gone. The Warsaw Pact, right?
Right.
NATO was a counter to the Warsaw Pact.
Right.
That's gone. The reason we kept it is because we want that money coming in, and we want the control over Europe. So acquiring Ukraine into NATO is further expanding eastward or westward, towards Russia, towards the Russian border. This is a red line. We're crossing it. The Russians came to the opinion that they had no choice, which
I think they're still threatening that essentially, right? They're still saying they're going to become part of NATO.
yeah, which is a ridiculous statement because you would have to change. The reason why the Russians invaded is because you cannot have an active conflict going on in your country to join NATO, right?
Right.
The Russians entered the country in 2014 and took over Crimea and started funding a civil war in the east with pro-Russian separatists because that prevents Ukraine from joining NATO. Same thing with Moldova, which is another country just down here, Ukraine's right here. Moldova has a little part of the country that's Transnistria,
Right.
and that's a Russian enclave, right? And that prevents Moldova from joining NATO.
Yep.
So these are just like little tricks that, it's
that they have to use.
It's the loopholes in fine print in NATO's agreements. But yeah, NATO has said that they're going to allow Ukraine in, but it's impossible. Right. And they don't want Ukraine anymore.
Do you think they're intentionally saying that to keep Russia coming.
Oh yeah.
Essentially.
Oh yeah. No, they are trying to continue the war.
Yeah.
And Europe in particular is really trying to keep this war going. Britain, France, Germany.
Right.
Because they're going to be holding the bag. See, this is the thing about U.S. proxy wars.
Yeah.
Is we never suffer from the failure of our proxy wars.
Right.
We didn't suffer from Afghanistan, right?
Right.
The Afghanis suffered. The ANA suffered when we pulled out. There were people gripping landing gear and falling off C-130s trying to get out of that country.
Right.
We lost 17 Americans at the bombing at that gate during the Kabul pullout.
Right.
It was a complete disaster.
Yeah.
It should have got Biden impeached.
Yeah.
Personally, I think. But they memory hold it, and it's Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So we don't care. Ukraine is no different. South Vietnam was no different. The Kurds in Syria, the Free Syrian Army in Idlib, same exact thing.
Right.
They're proxies. They're not allies. See, Israel is an ally.
Right.
We come to Israel's aid. We will nuke somebody for Israel. We're not trading Washington, D.C. for Kiev. And so to your question about the money.
Yeah.
The money has made a difference. It is the only thing keeping the Ukrainian economy going. There is no Ukrainian economy. It is fully funded by Europe and the United States, which is that's its biggest issue right now. Is it's lost its credit rating because Europe and the European banks are done with Ukraine because it's just a pit.
It's done,
right?
yeah.
And they're not benefiting from the corruption that was endless in Ukraine. You want to talk about, we've sent something close to $300 billion. I would argue that 150 billion of that has just disappeared. It's a laundry for U.S. cash and European cash. That money comes in and it just...
If we did an audit, we wouldn't.
We can't pass our own military audit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Ukraine, I mean, they have overturned their own government. Zelensky has fired numerous people for not only control, right, but also because they've had to pinch down on the corruption so much because they have to try to keep the war going. And there was so much money being stolen. Russia used to be horrible like this. Something this war has done has removed all of the oligarchs in Ukraine, in Russia,
Right.
which is what happened in 1991. They came in and they started owning everything, privatization of everything. Putin has gotten rid of all of those, at least the foreign ones,
I see.
because of the war, right? All of those companies had to pull out. We assisted Putin in reestablishing the Russian Federation.
If anything, our assistance has been more for Russia
we
rather than
have
for
made
Ukraine.
Russia the strongest that it has been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Probably since like 1984, because those last years of the Soviet Union were not strong.
Yeah.
Right. So we have created an absolute monster. And yeah, that money just, right. And what's going to end up happening is you're going to see all of these Ukrainian leaders are going to go into exile after this war because the regime will not stand. Whether it's pro-Ukrainian or not, pro-Russian, if the Russians take all of Ukraine, these individuals are going to go into exile, right? You're going to see Zelensky in Italy or Miami. He owns 2 multi-million-dollar places in those areas.
Kidding. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they all do.
Okay.
They all have villas and mansions and boats and yachts, and it's corruption.
Yeah.
They have endless U.S. cash flowing into the country. All they have to do is just siphon a little bit off the top, and everybody siphons all the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned something else in terms, kind of follow up on the money aspect. What's it doing to our military stockpile?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a really good conversation. So, I'm just going to take it back to what Ukraine has gone through.
Okay.
Because people have no understanding of this. I do this every day. So this is my entire life. Like I just focus on this. Ukraine has gone through 4 armies, or they're on their 4th army, right? So they had their army, which we built over, I don't know how long, 8 years, right? So since 2014, we've been building up their military.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Once the pro-Western government came in 2014,
Right.
Maidan happened. I consider it a foreign coup.
Yeah.
The U.S., one of the deputy secretaries of state, Victoria Nuland. If any of you don't know who Victoria Nuland is, she is literally probably the most despicable human being on the planet. She is responsible for a number of horrible situations. She's the war starter, right? She was very prevalent in Syria. She was trying to get the Syrian stuff going.
Right.
She was pushing hard for Libya to get bombed,
Right.
which it did. And she was handing out cookies to protesters in Maidan Square. It's a center square. It's like
No kidding.
think of in New York, Central
Oh, Times Square.
Times Square.
Yeah.
Like that. Like it's like a historical. They have a big statue in the middle. That's where the revolution happened. They called it the Revolution of Dignity.
Oh, yes.
What it really was a U.S. funded coup of the pro-Russian government in Ukraine to establish the pro-Western government. We started immediately building up their military. And then it kind of stopped over the Trump presidency. So that's why I talk about like Trump didn't go along with all of the spending and stuff in that way.
There's
Obama
progress
did.
here or there, yeah.
And then Biden, for 2 years, slammed arms and training and stuff into that country. And then in 2022, they were going to launch an offensive. The Ukraine was into the east of the country to settle the civil war.
Yeah.
And then they would be able to join NATO. So that's why the Russians invaded in February, is because the Ukrainians were about to go on the offensive in the east, and the Russians had no choice. They had to go now, or they were going to lose their enclave and what was preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. Whether you think that's morally right or not is not my issue. I'm not.
Yeah.
I step back and I look at it cold and calculated. It's geostrategic.
And there's tons of issues on that.
Oh
too.
yeah, and yeah,
You know, war's not, like you said, war's not good for anyone.
anybody.
Yeah.
Anybody. It's good for the military industrial
Yeah.
complex and the people that are making money off of it.
Right.
Sure. But
Yeah.
outside of that, not good
Yeah.
for
Good in their
not
eyes,
good for
essentially.
nation states
Yeah.
usually, especially when you're the one who has to fight it. And I know you probably are going to ask a question along the lines of, will the U.S. ever get directly involved? Absolutely not.
Right.
That's not what a proxy war is.
Yeah.
We don't, a proxy war is, the whole purpose is that you don't have to fight it.
Yeah.
You don't have skin in the game. It's why we're not allowing them to do specific things with our missiles, because if we allow them to strike Russia with our long-range strike weapons, like ATACMS we've given them, that would directly implicate us into the war, because we have to give them targeting parameters for their systems. In fact, I don't even know if the Ukrainians launched those
we're
missiles.
just giving them, the tools, essentially. We're not necessarily, guiding them.
No, we are.
Yeah.
No, we are.
And to what extent?
So in terms of, Ukraine would have lost day one if they didn't have full access to our ISR. For your listeners who don't know, ISR is intelligence.
Right.
Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Okay, that's ISR. So satellites, AWACS reconnaissance aircraft, anything you need to fight a war. Ukraine didn't have that. Ukraine doesn't have a satellite program.
Yeah.
They don't have imaging. They wouldn't be able to tell where the Russians are coming, when they're coming. The reason why Ukraine is fighting right now is because they have the entire NATO military backing them in terms of intelligence.
Right.
If they didn't have that, they would have lost immediately.
Yeah.
Right. And when I was talking about their armies, they had their built-up army.
Oh, yeah.
Then they had it was Soviet equipment, right? All old Russian stuff. Then they pulled everything out of Eastern Europe, out of the old Warsaw Pact countries, and because all of that equipment was directly compatible with their army. They didn't have to train on new systems. It was all old Soviet stuff.
Right.
That was the second army.
Okay.
So the Russians destroyed that first Ukrainian army within the first 3 months of the war, right? That army was gone.
So that puts us like summer of 21, essentially?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So right after the Istanbul negotiations failed,
Right.
everything like that, then we pumped all of that Eastern European equipment, which is all Russian. It's funny that they had to destroy their own army, basically. All of their surplus throughout Europe was donated.
And we're talking decades old equipment.
Oh, no, I mean, yeah, it is old equipment, but very applicable in the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
You don't need a $60 million Abrams on the battlefield to get stuff done. 30 T-72s are way better for the Ukrainian army than one Abrams. Because the logistics is crazy. Abrams run on jet fuel.
Yeah.
The T-72s are all diesel. They're all meant to run no matter what and be fixed in a barn.
The
like
mechanical cogs and all that stuff still goes a long way. Yeah.
This is what I talk about. What the U.S. being focused on the global war on terror and everything being a sniper rifle.
Yeah.
You have to clean a sniper rifle.
Yeah.
You have to get the scope right. You have to do all this work, right? When you have a machine gun, all you have to make sure is that thing doesn't jam. Right. And you're just spraying.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the First and Second Army. That army was then destroyed when they went on their offensives.
Right.
So again, we talk about Ukraine battling back the Russians and pushing them out of Kiev and all of this stuff. No, the Russians went in with 180,000 men expecting a negotiated settlement because that was, I mean, the alternative is the destruction of the Ukrainian state.
Right.
So in terms of self, your own, for your own benefit, probably don't fight a war against Russia.
Yeah.
Right. That's a bad idea. They went along with the war because that's what the West wanted. And they then went on the offensive in the Kharkov region and the Kherson region. And this was sort of the whole Russia is losing.
Yeah.
They were taking steps back because they didn't have the force in Ukraine to defend all of this territory that they had captured.
Right.
They didn't even really hold all of the territory. If you look at like where they came in from Kiev, they basically just controlled the highways.
Right.
It wasn't like they controlled the whole territory. So when they ended up pulling back,
were the main area for Ukraine.
Main
point.
Yeah. I mean, they controlled enough that they weren't like getting ambushed and stuff a whole bunch later on once everything had stabilized. But they only, like I said, they only had 40,000 troops for that whole northern advance. That's nothing. Right. And once you're getting attrited, you're losing some soldiers and equipment and stuff. They pulled out. They pulled out of Kiev. They pulled back when the Ukrainians went on the offensive in Kharkov. They couldn't hold their lines because they didn't have the manpower.
And they knew they weren't going in for what they...
Right? So all of those offensives cost the Ukrainians their second army, right? And that was really bad. So then they started their massive mobilization, which was no longer reserves, so no longer combat trained. Ukraine had been fighting a civil war for 8 years.
Right.
So they had a huge pool of reservists that had been combat trained and can pick up a gun and go fight, right? These new guys that are coming in have to be trained. So we had this massive European training program. They trained up like 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers.
Where some of the men were staying back and the
families.
families.
And this was the 2023 counteroffensive.
Right.
Right. So this was the summer counteroffensive. It was hyped up. It was this huge big deal. And all of the equipment that they used was NATO equipment. So this was a NATO trained army.
Shit.
All new Ukrainians, right? We built this army. It was Abrams, Leopards, Leopard 2 tanks, all top of the line NATO equipment. MRAPs started getting delivered. The army went from Soviet to NATO in about a year, which is impossible to manage, right? Logistically, it's impossible to manage. That army was then destroyed through the counteroffensive and Bakhmut, the Battle of Bakhmut. Now they're on their fourth and final army. They're not going to receive any more equipment. All the budgets for 2025, Ukraine isn't even in the U.S. budget for 2025. That last $8 billion we gave them recently was money. It was like use it or lose it money in the budget. Yeah. We had $8 billion left over, and we're like, we can either give this to them or it just gets recycled into the budget next year for whatever. Right. Right. It just goes away. And Ukraine isn't in the budget. Congress didn't approve it. So this is what I'm talking about. Ukraine is hooped.
So you think, let's assume, Harris administration gets in. Do you think, do they think it's just a slow death at that point?
Well, it's a slow death no matter what. Yeah. Even if we increased their funding 800% and started giving them every single weapon they needed, they don't have the human capital to keep this fight going.
And we're not sending anyone in.
Their army,
no one's sending anyone in.
Their army is no longer a professional army. It's professional in the sense that they're all combat experienced, right? Because they have to be, but they're no longer a well-trained peacetime army that is then transitioned into a wartime army and is like very capable. Right. They all have 2 weeks of training. The officer corps has been obliterated. At least the NCOs, which non-commissioned officers are vital when you're talking about field operations. Yeah, dead. They've all been annihilated, right? And Ukraine has really no path forward now. And the fact that they're still fighting is just horrible. It's just this continuation of this horrible slog.
Do you think Zelensky, what do you think he's thinking right now? Like, I just have to keep going along with this till it's done?
He's in the same position that Saddam was in. He's in the same position that any leader is in when they're losing, but they have no choice.
Got it.
Right? So he's already committed.
Yeah.
He can't uncommit to this. He can't be like, oh, now we want to talk about peace.
Yeah.
After we've lost X hundred thousands of men and our economy is destroyed.
So do you think there is some truth then that, when Harris goes around saying, well, Trump's just going to give up Ukraine?
They both are.
That's probably what's going to happen,
They
right?
both are. That's just a line. If Trump gets in, he'll probably actually try to make a deal with Putin.
Yeah.
Because he communicates with Putin openly. The Biden administration doesn't.
Yeah.
It's crazy. If he gets in, he might solve the war just because he might actually put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate.
Yeah.
He might make it a thing where he's like, we need to get a peace deal or you're going to and I'm not going to continue doing what the Democrats did.
Yeah.
Right? Because like I said, Biden is obsessed. Even if you look at like Hunter Biden, they have so much history in Ukraine.
Right.
It's a money laundering operation. It always has been. It has been since like 2011 for the United States.
Do you think, let's assume we're in Harris administration, just for, again, getting back to the theme, let's assume we're in a Harris administration. Unfortunately, the company dies, not the company, the country dies a slow death in the war.
Well, and let me just preface this by saying demographically, the country's done. Right. If you looked at the demographics before the war, a majority of the population is 40 plus, right? It's an old country that they aren't having babies. They were doomed no matter what.
So they're mostly gone already then.
Yeah, it was a very old state. And what you end up calling it is almost like a welfare state.
Yeah.
It's like you're so focused on the aging population that your economy is dead in the water. You're not having babies. Your next generation isn't there. And Ukraine hasn't mobilized 18 to 25-year-olds because it's the smallest portion of their population. And if they mobilize that group, they're admitting that their state has no future, right? Because that's the working class. That's your future of your country. Those are the people that are going to enter into the economy and produce for you. Yeah. 60-year-olds aren't doing anything. Right. That's the issue that the U.S. is in right now, too. Our baby boomer generation is the biggest group. Yeah. And so 50% of U.S. budget is focused on people age 50 plus. That's ridiculous. Yeah. They're not the future.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, we see it in I was mentioning earlier and who's been elected and, which party's making that transition, it seems like. So then do you think, and then I could kind of segue into something else. Do you think if Harris gets in, it seems inevitable, whether it's Trump or Harris, that this is done, eventually, whether it's in the next year, however long it takes.
Yeah, for sure.
If Harris is in, though, do you think we find a way to continue the conflict, whether it's directly with Russia? What do you think happens once Ukraine's done, if we're in Harris?
Once Ukraine is done.
Once Ukraine is done.
I think that they will have to chalk it up to a loss because there's really no options unless you want to go to war with Russia.
Directly.
And war with Russia is a bad idea for a number of reasons. One, we both have Dukes.
Yeah.
And any war between, I always say this, any war between the United States and Russia would have to be a nuclear war. Because the first thing that would happen is Russia would strike American aircraft carriers and U.S. military bases. The second that happens, it invokes U.S. nuclear doctrine. Right. Because the U.S., like I said, is not meant to fight a war like that. Mm-hmm. We can't if we lose our air power, we have no way to fight. So an aircraft carrier is the same as a U.S. city. If that is hit, it will be responded to the exact same way as a U.S. city being hit. So, that's the first issue. The second issue is it would just destroy the global economy. Even if you could prevent it from going nuclear, it would destroy the global economy. And Ukraine was the only proxy in the region, right? Ukraine was a monster country. It had one of the biggest military surpluses from the Soviet Union of any country in the world. And the eastern flank has been built up. It's like the DMZ in North Korea, right? Except it's way longer. So it's this huge fortification, and it's like one of the most heavily defended places in the world.
So do you think we, with this current administration, do you think we lost, I always like to refer back to some of the, Sun Tzu teachings. Do you think we're on the shitty end of that art of war, so to speak?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're not even trying. Like, that's the thing is we're so lost and confused about how we want to go about our foreign policy and and like I said, we have so many people that are old, right? They don't care what happens 10 years from now.
Right.
They're making decisions that make them money today.
Yeah.
And
How
make
they're
their
going to eat tomorrow, next week.
make their constituents money today.
Right.
So, they're whoever's lobbying for them in their campaigns and stuff.
Yeah.
That's what matters to them. So, what was the question again? Just so I don't forget
it. No. Just, once we're in that Harris administration, it sounds like there's just, it's just going to stop. Yeah, we're going to be done there.
Yeah. So there is no more Ukraine.
Yeah.
There is. And so what I think you're going to see is a transition.
Okay.
And I've been saying this for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
I said this in 2021 when Ukraine started.
Yeah.
I said, it is pertinent that a war is started before the election for the Democrats to get reelected. I thought it was going to be maybe Biden at the time, but Biden is getting old. So, or he is very old. So I was saying that, if Biden wants to get reelected, he's going to need a war. Wartime presidents don't usually get voted out of office because nobody wants change at that time.
Right.
And that it's sort of the situation that's developing, right? Is that they can't say that they lost. They'll never admit defeat, ever. They'll say that the Russian economy is destroyed, the Russian military is not what it is, and then they'll memory hole it and transition away. Because
some sort of propaganda to move on.
Oh yeah, and and I think it's going to be Iran. They're already talking about it. Like I said,
it's a more pressing issue.
Oh yeah. Iran is going to destroy America somehow, and they're 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon. By the way, Iran has been 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon since 2001. Yeah. John Kerry was up there talking about how Iran was 3 months away from getting a nuke. This is a propaganda tool that they will use again and again. They are that close to getting a nuke, but you can't just keep saying it and using it as a scary thing, right? They haven't tried to get a nuke. Why would they try now? Well, now they should. But, Iran is going to be the new focus because America's interests in Israel are way more important than American interests in Ukraine. The Biden administration is moving out, so the obsession with Ukraine is going to go away, right? Biden is obsessed with Putin and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Kamala isn't so much, and the establishment isn't so much. He and his administration really pushed that hard, right? That's not so much the thinking around the room, right? And when it comes to that art of war, we don't fight with the art of war.
Yeah,
we create chaos. That's what we do. The United States goes everywhere around the world, and we overthrow democracies and install dictatorships, basically. And we call them democracies, but and we profit and benefit from chaos. We create chaos somewhere, and then we solve that chaos.
Yeah, we create the problem
and that's what ISIS was.
Yeah.
We didn't create ISIS, but we created the vacuum, the power vacuum that allowed ISIS to establish themselves in Iraq.
Yeah.
Right? Can't do that. Same with Syria. That's why ISIS became so big, is because we started a civil war that destroyed Syria. And then who benefits?
Yeah.
The groups who are willing to take advantage. And that was ISIS at the time. And then we had to go in.
Man, that's deep. Yeah.
And we had to go in and fight ISIS.
Yep.
And we continuously create these issues. And we are so close to pulling out of the Middle East. This close, right? And we're out of Afghanistan. We're going to be out of Iraq. We're still illegally occupying Syria, by the way. People don't seem to realize. We talk about how Russia is so bad for invading a foreign country.
Right.
And we've invaded Iraq, Afghanistan. We bombed Libya. And we are knocking on, and we are currently occupying the oil fields, the Conoco oil fields in Syria.
Sheesh.
Because it's about our interests.
Yeah.
It's not about right or wrong.
Yeah.
So this is part of the whole, the Russians are bad.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we were invading other countries as the Russians invaded Ukraine. So no, they're not really bad. They're just they're fighting on an equal playing ground with the United States.
Yeah.
Right. There's just, I don't see a lot of hope for Ukraine. I don't see any hope for Ukraine itself, which is super sad because I always say I get a lot of shit online. People call me pro-Russian because I don't openly support Ukraine. And this is sort of the ideological aspect of it.
What is there to support at this point,
Yeah, that's the thing. again, it's this propagandized idea that Ukraine represents democracy and freedom and America and Western values.
I mean, are they saying that either, NATO or, the West, that includes the United States, is going to go back in there and build it back up?
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is that we're not even talking about that.
Right.
We're not even talking about going in and building them back up.
Right.
We haven't made any promises in that way.
Exactly.
We don't care. And I don't know why it's ideological.
And I think that's what people think. Once it's over, we're going to go back. People are going to come back. It's going to be...
BlackRock owns most of that country now.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I'm really hoping is that the Russians handily win, solve the issue, because if they solve the issue, Ukraine can start rebuilding and healing. If you're an actual pro-Ukrainian and you actually care about the Ukrainian people, the Zelensky regime is destroying the Ukrainian population.
Yeah.
Actually killing them and destroying the Ukrainian state for his own interests and the interests of the West, right? And so if you are a pro-Ukrainian individual, you should be really pushing for regime change in Kiev to a pro-Ukrainian government.
Yeah.
The current government isn't pro-Ukrainian in any sense of the word,
right?
Zelensky was a peace candidate. He ran on a peace platform with the Russians.
Man.
But he doesn't have any say. He's a puppet.
Yeah.
Right? And we tell him what to do, and we fund him. And if he doesn't...
He's been looking very, very spooked lately.
Yes. Oh, I would be, because the U.S., Trump is basically saying he's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
And the Kamala administration is saying the same thing with less words.
Yeah.
Because they can't openly say that they're going to stop funding the proxy war that they've been funding and pushing for 2 years.
Right.
But that it's over. They're not going to win. Right? So they're trying to hold out until the election's over. But if you follow my mapping account or my live streams or anything like that,
right,
you would know that the Russians are advancing faster than they ever have throughout the rest of the war, besides like the first couple of days when they
initially went.
And the Ukrainians weren't really ready. They're advancing faster than ever. The Ukrainian army is weaker than ever, right? They talk about, a massive artillery disadvantage.
Yeah.
10 shells fall for every one Ukrainian shell on the Russians, which is unbelievable. That's
crazy.
That's horrific.
Yeah.
And it's probably worse in some areas. The Ukrainian ammunition situation is horrible. And this is why I say that the West can't fight Russia. We don't have the military industrial base. Right?
And just to hit on that point really quick, on the stockpile, where did it put us? Where did it put the United States?
So the United States is not necessarily hurting for the things that it requires for its military in terms of like tanks.
Yeah.
We only gave 31 tanks. We didn't give anything in terms of that. MRAPs, we can make those. That's not a big deal.
Yeah.
If you don't know what an MRAP is, it's a heavy vehicle that's designed to take an IED.
Right.
Improvised explosive device. We can produce those. What really is crippling us is our munition production. So we produce a very limited number of artillery shells per year. And the way you have to think about this is Russia and all of their military industrial complex facilities, their production is state-owned, or it was at least, and it's state subsidized. So they can have huge factories, huge cities basically that are factories.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the cities in Russia, they have these sprawling industrial facilities that are like the size of Rio Rancho. They're massive. They're huge. And they weren't doing anything. They weren't producing anything. You know what we call that in the U.S.? Waste. That's spillage, right? From a capitalist point of view, those empty factories that you have to maintain and you're not producing anything and you're not making money from them are a waste.
Yeah, it's a liability.
A company can't hold that onto that. That's the problem with having a privatized military industrial complex, right? Is that they're focused on money. Yeah. Which is fine. Yeah. They're going to produce really good things.
Right.
But they aren't going to set up the state to be protected because that's not in their interests.
Got it.
The Russians, all they had to do was
get it going again.
3 months of training to get the guys back on the assembly lines, and they were pumping out equipment.
Yeah.
They have all of their own natural resources to do the work. They have all of their own mines, steel, everything. They produce everything themselves. So our sanctions didn't work, and their military industrial complex just started back up again. So when I talk about artillery shell production, the U.S. has stores of artillery shells in the Middle East, in Israel, in South Korea, for North Korea and in the Pacific Theater. We have a massive store. We borrowed almost everything we could, down to the absolute bare minimum of what we need to sustain like 2 weeks of fighting in these places, until we can get more ammunition shipped in, possibly.
Yeah.
We gave all of that to Ukraine. They burned through it like that because the U.S. is not built for industrial scale wars.
Right.
We're a sniper rifle. Again, we're specialists. So we gave them all of that. We even tried to increase our own production of shells at the Scranton plant in Pennsylvania. It's like the only plant really we have that produces artillery shells. And that has only increased from like 15,000 shells a year to 30,000 shells a year. The Russians are using 15 to 30,000 shells in 3 or 4 days.
Damn.
In the battlefield. Yeah, that's their artillery.
Crazy. That's some crazy
numbers.
numbers.
And if you look at the Soviet stockpiles, I mean, they had endless. They're probably getting to the bottom of their Soviet stockpiles because they've been firing so many artillery shells, but their production is so high that they don't need to worry about it. They're producing 1 to 3 million artillery shells a year compared to our 30,000. Again, our artillery rounds and our artillery guns and our barrels are designed to fire 1 artillery shell and take out Al-Qaeda in a tent. Right? That's the job. And that's what it's meant for. And that's what it's really good at doing. Yeah. If you need volume of fire, if you look at what happened to the M777, which is our staple artillery system in the United States, our barrels melted. They were bending and breaking and exploding because they're not built to fire and fire and fire and fire and fire. They're meant to fire and complete a fire mission and then be serviced and then return and then do a fire mission and be serviced and return, because that's how you keep everything really nice and neat and good and working well. Right. It doesn't work when you're in the middle of a real war. Yeah. Right. So I'm very concerned about the U.S.'s ability. Yeah. I'm very concerned that we will have to use tactical nuclear weapons immediately because we don't have the capabilities to defend ourselves properly. We're not the World War II army that we once were. We do not have our Cold War army to fight a large-scale war against a near-peer adversary like Russia or the Soviet Union was. Right. And it's just... we're in a very bad way.
Do you think we'd ever get there, though? Or do you think we would just move on?
Well, we would have to. So if we did get into a war, it would take 2 years to build the factories, to train everybody, and to get production level. It takes 1 to 2 years to get onto a military footing. That's what they call it. A wartime footing is where your economy shifts from civilian peacetime, you're producing all of the goods you need, to, all right, we need everybody who's not working to get into the employment ring and start producing equipment and weapons and stuff. And our economy is going to shift from this globalized trade and commerce to a military. And that's what happened to Russia. Right. So Russia has like 0 unemployment right now, right? 0%, because they have everybody's in the military or everybody's in a factory. Right. So the economy is running so hot right now because almost too hot to a point. They have such a huge budget. Yeah. Now they have like all this money coming in because even their oil sales increased. Europe never stopped buying Russian oil, even though they put an embargo on it. Right. They just buy it through India. It's Russian oil, but it's labeled Indian because it goes through Indian refineries and then gets shipped but Russia still gets paid. So they never lost their European market. They gained a massive Chinese market. Their economy hasn't taken the hit that we thought it would. Yeah. And the U.S. just has this like complete lack of capability to fight, and it would take 2 years if we got into a war that we needed to fight. Yeah. Right? So we would have this huge gap in our production and our needs, and it's very concerning. And a lot of people in the Pentagon are raising flags about it. And again, it just doesn't make sense for companies until the war is happening, right? Until those contracts are in their hands from the government saying, we need you to produce X amount of munitions. Yeah. They're not going to do it. Right. Because if they do it, they're taking on the risk. They're taking on the liability.
Yeah, they're not going to be used.
What if there isn't a war? Sold. Yeah. What if I produce 1,000 artillery guns for you and you need 50 of them because we don't actually go to war? Yeah. I lose. Right. My company takes the hit. I'm not doing that. So that's the big issue. And
that makes sense, though, because that's from the perspective of just thinking of it as a business.
And that's exactly what it is. Yeah. It is. It's exactly what it is. Yeah. And that's why everything that the Russians produce is so much cheaper, too. Yeah. The equivalent system in Russia is going to be 1/8 of the cost.
Because it's actually the government doing it.
It's the government doing it, and there is no financial incentive for the producer necessarily, unless you're exporting. And the U.S. military industrial complex is like 90% exports. We export all over the world, right? That's what Russia does too. But when it comes to their military, their costs are so much lower because they're not getting fleeced. Because they don't have the budget. They don't have the option to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas in the United States, we have a $900 billion military industrial complex budget, right?
Right.
And that just I mean, why would you produce a plane that costs let's say 12 million a unit, which is like a normal cost of a fighter aircraft, when you could produce an F-35 that costs 35 million a unit, right?
Right.
And the development was close to $2 trillion.
Shit.
And it was, I mean, the budget was like some 850 million for the development of the F-35, and it ended up being $2 trillion. It's ridiculous.
Crazy.
It's ridiculous. And like I said, every single congressional district has an F-35 manufacturing facility in it, right? Every single congressional district gets money from the federal government when they vote in line with the military-industrial complex. So that's part of the issues.
Well, I think, that gives at least, the viewers out there that are thinking about, well, what's going to happen with the war?
Yeah.
Whether it's under this administration or the other, it sounds like, to me, it seems like, whether Russia gets all or some, that might be the better thing to do, stop the bleeding literally and theoretically. And because whether it's Harris or other folks, they'll say, well, Trump's just going to give up, Ukraine.
Yeah.
He's going to have all or part of it. They're going to become stronger. Then that's really going to be an issue.
Yeah.
Do you see that as actually being the greater issue, or is the issue already done because we forced them to become better? Like you said, they've gained experience on the battlefield now. They've had to, revamp their assembly lines for, wartime production, things of that nature. Is the damage already done? So really giving them the land isn't really the damage. It's already done. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So from a geostrategic perspective, giving Russia that territory is not going to be good.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're talking about what the U.S. and what Europe wants,
right,
having Russia's sphere of influence expand into Europe,
right,
is exactly the opposite of what the entire Ukraine project was about. Right.
Got it.
So if Russia ends up controlling, let's just say they capture everything up to the Dnieper River, right?
Yeah.
That's the dividing. It's like halfway through the country. It just kind of makes sense that that's going to be the end line.
Yeah. It'd be a good boundary.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a good defensive boundary for both sides. It stops everything. Will the Russians go further? Potentially.
Yeah.
And after this Kursk incursion, after the Ukrainians invaded Russia into Kursk, which is still going on, complete nightmare disaster, didn't accomplish anything other than completely destroy the possibility of negotiations.
Yeah.
Because the Russians had offered the Ukrainians a deal in June. They said, if you guys accept NATO neutrality, if you offer protections for Russian culture and speak and language in your country, because the Ukrainians have been basically trying to ethnically cleanse Russia out of their...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and half of their population speaks Russian.
Yeah.
Right? Like literally Russian, not Ukrainian Russian, Russian.
Right.
So there's
especially in that area.
Oh, yeah. The east of the country is almost all Russian. And if you remember, the Soviet Union, I mean, that part of Ukraine was Russia.
Right.
And something that Stalin did, and it's evil, but it's really good if you want to maintain control, is he built all of these countries. Like Lenin established Ukraine. Ukraine was not a state, and the state that it is makes no sense. Yeah. You have a huge chunk of it that's Polish. You have a chunk of it that's Hungarian. You have a chunk of it that's Romanian. You have a chunk of it that's Belarusian. You have a chunk of it that's Ukrainian, like a traditional Ukrainian, and then you have the Russian side. Do you know why they did that?
Why is that?
To keep everybody fighting. If you're too worried about somebody of a different culture, and Crimea was the Turkish Tartars. So there's... are Crimean Tartars, but they're Turkish, basically.
Yeah.
And they did this in the Asian countries too, that the Soviet Union controlled. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. If you look at their borders, they're ridiculous. They're like, it's like puzzle pieces that intertwine into each other.
Yeah, no sense.
And they cut off, and it's interesting because they'll cut off each other's water. So one country will control another country's water rights, basically, and one country will have a massive population of another country, so that's an issue.
Yeah.
Keep them fighting, and they're never worried about what's going on in Russia. Right? They're never worried about the big issue.
Yeah.
They're worried about the little issues that are in their daily life. Same thing happens to us.
Yeah.
It's just good to keep your population distracted and not focused on the bad things that you're doing. So Ukraine is a cultural nightmare. It's being pulled apart. And this is part of the issue is like, if you look at Ukrainian history, the Poles and the Ukrainians don't get along. If you know what the Vovolin massacre is, a lot of there's a whole denazification thing that the Russians push in Ukraine.
Right.
And the reason they push that is because the national hero of Ukraine is Stefan Bandera. He is a perpetrator of the Holocaust. Yeah. He killed a lot of Jews and a ton of Poles in Vovolin because the Ukrainian national movement, the OUN, was basically just a nationalistic movement. And then when the Nazis invaded, they decided we're going to join you instead of fighting you with the Russians because they didn't like the Russians.
Oh, okay.
Right. So they were freedom fighters trying to escape the Soviet Union, basically.
That makes
and when
sense.
the Germans came in, they were like, we're going to go with you. The Germans allowed them to perpetrate genocide against the Poles in the country.
Right.
And this has been a point of contention between Poland and Ukraine. So it's so funny to watch them supporting Ukraine. But then when you listen to the politicians talk, they're arguing about massacres from 60 years ago because the Ukrainians won't acknowledge them.
Yeah.
And the Poles want them to acknowledge them. So there's this the whole system isn't designed to work. And if the Russians capture all of Ukraine or a big chunk of it,
Let's say that river.
Yeah,
that
it's
river.
going to increase their geopolitical influence over all of Eastern Europe. And you're already seeing it. They're improving relations with Hungary. They're improving relations with Slovakia. You're going to see the European Union weaken incredibly. So the damage has been done.
Yeah.
Germany is deindustrialized. Yeah. Which, by the way...
It would just further the damage, essentially.
Which, by the way, I'm not saying anybody's ever going to see this, but the Duran came up with that term, deindustrialization. Yeah. So I'm just going to give them credit there. Yeah. It's another podcast.
Oh, gotcha.
They do Ukraine. They do all sorts of geopolitics stuff. They're huge.
Check them out.
Yeah, check them out. They came up with that term, deindustrialization. And that term speaks to... The German economy was an industrial economy. They produced cars. They produced all sorts of stuff, right? But they relied on cheap Russian energy. Yeah. The U.S. destroyed Nord Stream, the pipeline, blew it up, cut off their energy, and Germany took it because they have no choice. They're a vassal state. Yeah. Germany is nothing. Germany agreed basically to the destruction of their economy for no good reason. Right? No benefit because they thought they were going to beat Russia and then it wasn't going to matter. They were going to have all the free energy they wanted from Russia because they were going to control it. Yeah. Right? Yeah. We didn't lie to them necessarily. We thought we were going to win. Yeah. And it didn't work. So it was just a misjudgment on everybody's end. But yeah, the damage is done. We have created the Russian beast that we set out to prevent. The Russian military is very strong, and now it is poised. Yeah. This is something that we talked about. The Russian army that went in 2022 was a joke. Right. It was a peacetime army that was corrupt and inefficient and ineffective, and their special forces was pretty good, like their VDV, like their 101st Airborne and stuff like that. Like in the U.S., we have like really high quality units. Yeah. But it's just not enough. Right now. The Russian military is probably one of the best in the world with drone warfare, which is a nightmare.
Yeah, I've seen tons of those videos.
Yeah, the FPVs, which are the ones that fly in and hit people, gnarly. The grenade drops, horrible. They have Lancets, they have strike UAVs. This was something that was unheard of in the Russian military before 2022. They were decades behind in some areas, right? That was one of them. Now they're one of the most advanced in the world. Their actual infantry is the best in the world now, bar none, and they have the most of it. And their economy is now focused on the war.
Yeah.
It's a wartime economy. So what happens when the war ends, right?
Yeah.
This is something that everybody's talking about. What's the next conflict?
Right.
Where does Russia go after this? Because they can't slow down. If they were to stop and try to retransition their economy, they're going to have 5 years of rough go where they're trying to transition, and then they'll stabilize and come out of it.
Right.
They might end up doing that. What I think is going to end up happening is you're going to see Russia go in a different direction.
Some other country.
Probably solve Syria and really start expanding their sphere of influence in the Middle East, assisting Iran, growing Iran's sphere of influence, and then potentially the Caucasus as well. So Georgia,
So I guess, yeah.
that area, that's still an issue that needs to be solved. Probably.
So you think...
And let me just preface this by saying, I think that we are in for at least a decade of war.
Continuing.
The United States, Russia, China, Iran, going at it with these proxy wars. We're going to see a couple Ukraines, a couple Isreal situations over the next decade. This is going to be, because we can't fight each other.
Right.
It would be nukes.
Yeah.
But we want to destroy each other, or just, control each other and be the dominant hegemony. And to do that, we have to fight proxy wars. That's what the whole Cold War was, right?
Yeah.
Korea was the United States fighting Russia in North Korea.
Yep.
Because everybody thinks China was the real supporter, but Russian aircraft were supporting the Koreans. South Vietnam was against the Russians again.
Right.
Grenada, same thing. Lebanon, same thing. So all throughout the Cold War, we were fighting these proxy wars against, because it was a nuclear war if we fought them directly. So that's what you're seeing in Ukraine. It's the U.S. funding Ukraine to fight Russia so that the U.S. doesn't actually have to fight Russia, but Russia has to fight.
Right.
The next one will probably be a Russian proxy war against the United States.
Wow.
So somewhere in the world where the U.S. has some interests, and we're seeing it a lot in Africa. Russia is in control of Africa.
Yeah. And when you say that, do you think that would require us to get actual boots on the ground?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that would be, in that situation, the proxy war would be Russia potentially, or China potentially funding, or Iran funding a conflict somewhere that's vital to U.S. interests that we can't let go of.
Right.
So sort of what you're seeing in Israel is sort of that, right? Is there's this war that's going on, and I see Israel as the aggressor, and I think that the U.S. is in a very desperate situation, so they're being very aggressive. Again, trying to create chaos to benefit off of it, to capitalize. And Russia is supporting Iran, right? And China is supporting Iran.
Right.
Because if the U.S. is distracted with Israel in the Middle East, they're not focused on Ukraine, they're not focused on Taiwan.
Right.
Again, it's just like this chess game. You have this constant chess game going on.
Do you think...
And the players never fight, but the pieces fight.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, especially in this day and age where things are, I think you bring up a good point, where things are getting a lot more sophisticated. We're not really thinking, although it did happen somewhat in Ukraine, it's not the old school traditional, war that we think of or we see in movies. It's a lot more calculated. It's a lot more, like you said, proxy war. It's a lot more, it's a different era of war, essentially.
It is a different era of war. It's an old era of war.
Yeah.
So it's World War I in terms of, at least Ukraine, is World War I in terms of like the movement. Yeah. Like it's trenches. You're in trenches and stuff like that. And we got so far away from this because we forgot what a real war was. Remember, you're fighting proxy wars. Yeah. So Ukraine is the biggest proxy war we've seen. Like Vietnam was kind of close, but Vietnam's terrain is completely different. Right. So it was like we were going and capturing hills and then leaving them because we couldn't hold anything because it was a jungle. Yeah. Right. There's nothing to hold, and the enemy has concealment and can do whatever. In Ukraine, it's flat and open. Right. Yeah. So they dug trenches. Right. They have these fortifications. They can't move a lot right now. Because the Ukrainians have these strong fortifications that they're defending. The Russians are almost through them. The war we're seeing is very World War I-esque, where the individual doesn't matter. Like in the global war on terror, when the U.S. went into someplace, every single Marine unit was like kicking in doors and accomplishing objectives and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You have whole brigades in Ukraine that all they're doing is being target practice, basically. They're just sitting and they have to sit and defend, right? They can't not be there or the Russians take it. And then the Russians are just dropping bombs and artillery shells on them. So it is a technologically advanced war, but it is reminiscent of older wars.
Yeah.
And it's something that the U.S. should really pay attention to, because no matter how much technology you have, you're going to find yourself in a gut eventually, right? And you're going to be stuck, and you need to fight your way out of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, having the best top of the line stuff is not always going to get you there.
Right. No, I think that's an important point. Let me ask you this. I think I think our conversation has went along nicely. It's kind of checked some of the boxes already, but I think the next question I would have, I mean, I have my opinions, but who do you think is the United States' number one enemy? Some people say China. It might be Russia now, given what we've created, essentially. It might be both. Is there one that's the main enemy, or is it both? You know,
probably the current United States deep state is the biggest
number one
enemy of you and me and every other American, because they're going to go try, because they're going to tell you that Russia is your enemy.
Yeah.
They're going to tell you that China is your enemy.
Right.
They're going to tell you these things, but never really give you good reasons why.
That's
right. They're never going to, they're just going to tell you, and they're going to expect you to believe it, because since you were a little kid, every single movie you've watched, who's the bad guy? Every single video game you've ever played, every Call of Duty, who's the bad guy?
Yeah.
It's Russians
Russia
or China,
Yep.
right? Those are the bad guys.
Yep. Metal Gear Solid.
In fact,
man.
the reason why China isn't the bad guy in a lot of movies is because they're a huge market for our cinema.
Yeah.
So did you see the second Red Dawn?
Yep.
The script had it China.
Yeah.
Because North Korea makes no sense.
Right.
But we couldn't have it be we couldn't have it be China because we wanted to sell the movie in China.
Right.
So that's part of why you haven't seen the propaganda go in that direction, because we are a globalized economy.
Yeah.
And Russia is not a big market, so we can make them into a boogeyman. But China is probably what I would consider to be our biggest near peer.
Okay.
I don't like the term enemy, because I don't think anybody has to be enemies.
Right.
I think what would benefit both countries would be trading with each other and having wildly open trade and just paying each other for everything. And everybody's making money and everybody's happy. Nobody has issues.
Right.
That's not how human nature works.
Exactly.
We're greedy. We want more.
We want power.
We want everything. We want control. We want the better deal, right? So, yes, I think China is what I would consider our biggest competition.
So they're still ahead of Russia, essentially.
Oh, I mean, economically for sure. Yeah, and they're poised population-wise to be incredibly strong. They're destroying us in terms of STEM. Like their production in STEM is outpacing us immensely. Yeah. Like we used to brain drain from the world. Right. We used to pull, it happened to the Soviet Union, right? After the collapse, all of the best came over here, started working for us. And it helped us immensely. Right. It happens often. America used to be that, right? Now, why wouldn't I go to China? They're the cutting edge. They're the ones leading. They're going to pay me the most for this, right? They have the best colleges. Russia also destroys the United States in STEM graduates. Yeah, like they focus on that. And the biggest issue, I would say, and this is why I say the deep state is our biggest enemy. Yeah. Is because when I like that, because, I mean, I bet a lot of people weren't expecting that answer. And I like it because I think, sometimes, the downfall comes from within. Oh, yeah. It's always that. I mean, if you look at any empire throughout human history. Yep. That is really what it ends up being, right? Rome. Why did Rome fall? Yeah. It's not outside sources. Right. Everybody was partying while the empire burned. Right. Right. Everybody was enjoying themselves, and that's really what we are in right now. We are in the celebratory phase, and the I don't know. We're in that phase of we don't want to maintain the empire. We want to enjoy everything that the empire has to offer. Yeah. Right. That's what we want. And this is what I say about our leadership too. They inherited the hegemony. Yeah. They didn't have to build it. Right. They don't know how to maintain it. They don't care about it the same way.
Right.
It's the same as a renter, right? When you own a house, that's your property.
Yeah.
You have to keep that upkept.
Right.
When you're renting,
Yeah, you just call the owner, hey, this broke,
or,
that broke.
or you don't.
Oh, you don't?
Because
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. You don't have to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's not yours. You're
Yeah,
going
you
to
just
treat
leave it.
you're going to treat things differently, right?
Yeah.
You're going to treat the carpet worse. You're going to treat the walls worse, everything.
Yeah.
That's sort of the politicians and the leadership
Yeah.
we have now. They inherited all the wealth. They inherited the good times. They don't know how to keep it.
It goes back to that saying, you know.
Hard times create. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what we have right now. And the deep state is what I consider the permanent establishment.
Yeah.
The lobbies, the people who never get voted out, that's the deep state. And the real deep state might not be visual. You might not see it because power usually commands from the darkness.
Right.
But you can see at least the face of it. You can see what you're supposed to see, right? And it's very obvious that they don't give a damn about any of us, right? And this is what I talk about when I talk about Russia and China. You can disagree with their
Way of
governance.
life. Yeah.
You can disagree with every aspect of what they do. But when you look at how they put money into infrastructure, when you look at how they put money into education,
Yeah.
when you look at how they value the family unit, when you look at how they value conservative values, and I don't necessarily mean that, you know, progressive values aren't necessarily a bad thing,
Yeah.
but they tend to lead to the degradation of the society.
There's no lines in the sand.
Exactly. And this is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire went from a established republic with honor and dignity, right? It was for the Roman Empire. And some people might call that even like more nationalistic or fascistic, which is fine. And it has its downsides. But the one thing that's strong is everybody's on the same page and working towards the same common goal.
Yeah.
What ended up happening is you had a Roman Empire that was more focused on individual preference, highly interested in sexual orientations and stuff like that,
Right.
which is exactly what we're getting into. And this is it's just a pattern. And it's just what happens, right? You have to build the empire, and that's the hard part. That's 1776 to World War II.
Right.
That is hard times. That's the Dust Bowl. That's, you know, the U.S. not being the strongest. We had to colonize all of the territory. We had to build everything. We had to establish ourselves. We won World War II. We had no competition.
Right.
That was the good times. That was the early days of the Roman Empire. 1945 to 2000 and maybe 8, you could say, was just this period where every American could buy a home. Every American was making a living wage.
Yeah.
Every American had everything they needed.
The dream was still
thriving. And guess what happens when you have that?
Yep.
You stop focusing on, are my kids going to be better than me? Are my kids going to benefit the country? Is the country looking after my kids? Are they looking after the future? Are we moving in the right direction? You're more focused on me.
Right.
I am the individual. I matter. I'm very important. And it is important to have individuality, right?
Right.
And like freedom of speech and stuff like that, and culture,
The vision's
and
not
art,
there.
and everything.
Yeah.
But when you have no direction and you're just selfish in all of your thinking, which I don't blame any American for being selfish in their thinking, because it's what America is now.
Yeah.
If you're not looking out for yourself, you're not going to succeed.
Right.
Right. And it's just not going to happen. I would say that, yes, China is our biggest adversary, but
Just because they're at that level.
really your biggest adversary is the people who tell you that everything is okay when everything is clearly not okay.
Right.
The adversary is the people who stare at you and look at you in the face and say that money for hurricane relief, for FEMA, for American citizens is not as important as money for illegal immigrants to have housing and
Whatever
support
it
from,
is,
from FEMA, right?
Right.
I'm not saying that illegal immigrants shouldn't have some sort of, safety net in the country, especially if you're asylum seeking or something like that. But it should be legal immigrants that are getting those benefits.
Right.
You should be helping legal immigrants that are coming into the country establish themselves.
Right.
Right? Because they're paying into the economy. They're benefiting the economy.
Right.
You have them sitting there and telling you that we can only give $750 to people who have lost everything, who have been citizens of the United States since they were born, that have been paying taxes since they were 18, right? That's your enemy. Those are the people that don't care about you.
You're right.
They don't care about your kids. They don't care about your future. They care about their needs, their money, and their reelection. That's your enemy.
Man, that's deep. I love it, though. I love it. I think that gives a lot of people perspective in, what it really means when we say, what's going on overseas, what's going on around the world.
Sure.
Because like you said, I think we're like this, right now. And I think...
I mean, look at it anywhere. If you look at any mainstream media, all it is arguments.
Yep.
It's first off, it's part of the algorithm. It's what gets numbers. Right. People like to watch battles.
Yeah, I do it myself. Yeah.
When we watch UFC, right?
Yeah.
It's like an emotional investment.
Right.
We watch debates because they're combat.
Right.
It's human nature. We love fighting.
Right.
So they play off of that.
And I think that's where we're at. And I think one of my main theories is we need to go back to that common ground.
Yeah.
What's that? Freedom, those values, those traditions that we're fighting for. Because I really feel like now I can't really see the lines.
Yeah, and this is part of the thing when they talk about Trump and they refer to Trump as like a racist or anything like this when he talks about make America great.
Yeah.
He's not saying that America was, and I'm not defending Trump, by the way. I don't think that really my vote matters at all. I think that nothing really changes.
Yeah,
Whoever
you're
gets
still going to vote though, right?
Oh yeah, you have to vote.
Yeah.
And if I got drafted in the military, I'd probably still go fight, even though I would disagree with the war because I benefit from the system.
Right.
So I feel like I have a certain amount of debt to it.
Yeah.
Even though,
and see, that's what I'm talking about right there. You know, that belief, that
which is not a belief that most people have.
100%.
Most people, if there was a draft right now, most people would draft Dodge because it's about them.
Yep.
Right. And that's fine. Again, I don't blame you for doing that. I just have like a kind of a set of principles where if I'm going to enjoy the freedom of speech, if I'm going to enjoy my Second Amendment, if I'm going to enjoy the right to not be have illegal search and seizure occur, if I'm going to have the right to, my silence.
Yeah.
I plead the fifth.
Yep.
If I want all of those rights, if I want women to have the right to vote and stuff like that, and I want the right to exercise my religious beliefs however I see fit, I also have to pay into the system that allows that to happen.
Right.
I also have to protect that system that allows that to happen. And this is why I talk about this stuff so much, is that the system is broken.
Yeah.
And it is very clearly broken. There's remnants of it. We can fix it.
Right.
But we have to have fundamental shifts in thinking. And unfortunately, I don't think the American population is, one, educated enough in their own way.
Yeah.
They don't have the urge to go self-educate because nobody's going to tell them.
Life's so convenient
This
now.
this is the best format for this because everybody who's listening has complete access to this information. Right. The only way is if we get censored. Right. Yeah. So everybody
don't censor us
and don't listen to us wholesale. Don't believe what we say. Take it in and analyze it and make decisions for yourself based off of the information being provided.
Right.
Right. You only have your own perspective. That's the only thing you can be sure of in this world. Yeah. Because for all I know, or for all you know, I'm an NPC. Right? This is a simulation, and all you can do is go off of what your reality is. Right. So take in as much information as you can and try to make educated, informed decisions based off of that, and try to listen to the opposition. Yeah. Because you will learn very quickly. You will learn very, very quickly that everything that you've been told about the people you're supposed to hate is usually completely wrong. Right. You will find new things that you don't like about them. Yeah. Which is fine. Which is awesome, because then that shows you what you don't want to repeat. Right. Right. And this is a very important thing about learning history too. Right. Is because we are just repeating history over and over and over again. And if we go into a war with Iran or something like that before the election, that will be our Suez moment. And if you don't know what a Suez moment is, go Google Suez moment and learn something.
There you go.
And
There's your homework.
Yeah, and it's just like you can't just sleepwalk into this stuff.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're doing.
And do you think, without opening another can, I feel like they've put us in that position to either one, not have the ability to do that because we're so stuck on whether it's working too much, to even just survive, get food on the table, stuff like that, we can't even do that. Yeah. But I think I want to transition into, we've talked about this topic of, all the things that are somewhat on the ballot. Sure. It might not change drastically, but, there's going to be differences here and there. What can, of course, vote. We encourage everybody to vote. Yeah. You're a candidate of choice, but don't vote blindly.
Yeah. Don't vote on one issue.
Yeah.
Because you might be pro-choice,
right,
or pro-life, and you vote that way. But what you're voting for on top of that could be extremely detrimental to you.
It might outweigh that one.
And this is something that the black community in the United States is finally starting to figure out, I think. The Democrats have had the black vote in their pocket for decades, and nothing has improved for the black community in the United States of America. It has arguably gotten worse. Lyndon B. Johnson's plan that basically incentivized single mother homes in the black community, in urban communities, which ended up being mostly black,
right,
destroyed the black community. It's wild when you look at like statistics, because African Americans were doing economic, by almost every standard, economic, crime statistics in the 1960s during Jim Crow in some parts of America. The African American community was doing multiple times better than they are right now. They didn't have, they were improving economically compared to whites. They were catching up. They were, they had fathers in the home. That was vital. They did not have drug issues in their communities.
Right.
It's like old school Harlem. It's like the idyllic setup for the African American community.
Yeah.
Close knit, very strong. I mean, it's idyllic for any community.
Yeah.
And Lyndon B. Johnson came in and promoted this Better Path Forward for America, which was supposed to help single mothers.
Right.
But what it ended up doing was incentivizing single mothers.
Exactly. Why promote it?
Yeah. And that destroyed the black community.
Yeah.
And that has continued to this day. Yeah. And they still have yet to figure out that the reason why this is happening is because they're voting Democrat. And the Democrats always make promises, never keep them, right? And the only way the black community is going to get out of the issues that they're in is by moving into a, I would say, more conservative line of thinking, where you have more traditional values, and that brings fathers back into the home, and it creates a strong black community. And I talk about this specifically because it's such a hot button issue in the United States.
Yeah, it is.
And what we're seeing this election is African American men are not voting for Kamala.
Right.
And it's going to be devastating for her in this election that she's losing that base. And I think it's really because they're starting to figure out, and this is what I always say to everybody, when you go to vote, the only thing you should think of is, if you're going to vote along party lines, am I better off now than I was 4 years ago? And I'm not talking about COVID.
Yeah.
Because COVID is like this weird microcosm where Trump...
Yeah, it's an outlier.
Everybody thinks that Trump ended his presidency horribly because we were in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
It's like he didn't have anything to do with that.
Yeah.
Think about the 3 years prior to that, when you were paying $1.90 for gas, right? When you could afford to buy a home because interest rates were low.
Yep.
Right? That's what the Trump economy, at least you could say it was from, previous Obama or whatever, but his economy was strong.
Yeah.
Biden's economy.
And even if it was, he kept it up.
Yeah, he kept it up.
Yeah.
And the only reason it ended up ever taking a hit was the pandemic, which we overreacted to. We shouldn't have done what we did because it didn't benefit the situation at all, but we didn't know. And that's like where people talk about, Biden has created X amount of jobs. No, he hasn't. He has reestablished pre-COVID job numbers.
Yeah.
And people who have 2 jobs have increased dramatically.
Right.
That's job creation.
Yeah.
That's what they count as job creation. Those aren't new jobs. Those are the unemployment numbers increase, but the number of jobs also increase.
Yeah. One theory I also have on that number issue is, what about the people that are working 2 jobs?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's a majority of the new
Yeah.
jobs being created are second incomes.
Right.
So same people working 2 jobs, but they count them as 2.
Yep.
And it doesn't make any sense.
It
It is actually worse for the economy when you have people working 2 jobs.
Yeah.
It's bad. Yeah.
Right. Because then they can't spend. Obviously can't spend more.
Also, it's why I am. This is not actually serious, but sort of like a hypothetical I run through is, I don't know why women ever wanted rights. It's crazy.
Well,
dude.
it's funny you see a lot.
Well,
of
they had rights.
Yeah.
They had
Yeah,
all
yeah,
the
yeah.
rights. They just didn't have the right to vote.
Yeah.
And what came along with that was, I mean,
you hear a lot of women saying that now too.
Well, we put them into the economy.
Yeah.
That's why we wanted women to have the right to vote, is because we wanted them to start working, because that boosted our economy insane. We went from, we basically almost doubled the workforce.
Yeah.
Right. Moms stopped staying at home and started working, which is great for women. If you want to
Right.
work, go work. I'm not trying to say anything like that.
Yeah.
But put us on a path.
They're rethinking it now.
Yeah, it put us on a path where, we're looking at horrible birth rates.
Yeah.
We have horrible families, like family home conditions, like
Right.
living standards are dropping.
Yep.
Education is getting worse.
Oh man, it's outdated too.
It's horrible.
What we talked about the main topics of foreign affairs, foreign geopolitical issues. What can we do as fellow Americans, you and I, everybody watching, to just help with whether it affects the topics we covered today, or just going out to vote. What can we do, whether it's now just moving forward as Americans, to maybe steer this ship in a little bit different direction, to start, building back that American dream, things of that nature that, isn't as, maybe it's not dead, but it's not as easily attainable as it used to be. What can we just everyday folks do that you think?
Care. I think that that's probably the primary thing that we have lost, is we don't care. We don't care what happens to the United States. Does the Pledge of Allegiance mean anything to anybody? Does the national anthem really mean anything to anybody anymore? Right. Does anybody think of themselves as American? What does American even mean anymore?
Do you fly that flag?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not even like, rah, rah, America, I got this on the back of my truck, we're doing this. No, it's like, do you care about the body politic? Do you care about your neighbor? Because even I'm guilty of this sometimes. It's just the thinking is you're thinking about yourself. Because does your neighbor care about you?
Yeah.
You don't know, right?
Well, if you think about it, back even when I was a kid, you would think like that to a certain extent. Now, even I'm guilty of it.
I don't even know my neighbors anymore.
100%.
I feel like we have voluntarily isolated ourselves because of to start, everything in our face is fear.
Yeah.
Where everything that the news puts in front of our face, it gets numbers, right?
Yeah.
Again, this is part of like the algorithmic part of being a human, is that the things that we pay attention to are the things that create fight or flight. Yeah. So serial killers, kidnappings, all of this, right? It's fear. And
it's true.
And it started to come up in the 1990s, and as culture and everything became more sensationalized and free, I would say, in terms of like art. We got away from a more conservative, it started in the 70s with the music, right? The music starts changing.
Right.
Or in the 50s, even Johnny Cash, rock.
Yeah.
That was bad. That was like unheard of. Like he was like a menace. And Elvis too.
Yeah.
And their music is like, it's like nothing. It's like you listen to it today.
Now.
Oh man.
My gosh.
I mean, dude, it's especially like the hip hop and R&B is awful. It's just like, I mean, it's catchy. The beats are cool.
There used to be, metaphors and stuff like that. And now it's just blatant.
Even if it's symphony music, it promotes a certain kind of idea.
Yeah.
Right. And when you are inundating people with fear and sex and all of this stuff constantly, it really makes you scared and self-isolate and just focus on yourself. And that's detrimental to
society,
American society, global society. It's very beneficial to the people at the top who don't want you to pay attention, don't want you to care about your neighbor, don't want you to care about voting, don't want you to care about any of that.
Yeah.
If they could get rid of elections, they would.
Right.
They're doing it with Kamala. Nobody voted for Kamala. You have an option between Trump and not Trump. Like that's what they did. Because Kamala, if anybody remembers, when she ran against Joe Biden in the primary, got less than 1% of the vote. She was the lowest on that whole stage of 14 people or whatever. And now she's the Democratic nominee without a single vote going her way.
Right.
There was no primary. Biden was supposed to be the president.
Right.
And then Biden just gave all of his delegates to Kamala, which means that in the next election, if Kamala wins, Kamala could just give all of her delegates to whoever is the Democrat nominee, and you never have to vote. It
starts a horrible precedent.
As long as you can make it seem like the president has dementia or is incompetent, you just put whoever you want in.
Yeah.
This is what I talk about when we're talking about like previous empires.
Right.
Look at Rome. Rome was a republic. The United States is a republic.
Yep.
The only way a republic ends is voluntarily.
Yep.
The Roman Republic ended when Caesar came back and, the whole Ides of March happened and then the republic died.
Yep.
And that's the thing is I don't think we care about being a republic. I don't really think we care about democracy. I
honestly think that's the number one.
I think we're told we're supposed to care.
Heart issue. Yeah, definitely.
And I think very, very soon we are going to transition away from the democratic republic that we have because it doesn't suit the country that we live in anymore. Yeah. And that's scary because that's tyranny, right? That's directly how we head down the road to tyranny.
Well, what, you mentioned care. So, I think we could all
care and educate. And this part of caring is educating yourself, being able to understand when somebody's lying through their teeth to you and not, just trying. I mean, there's a difference between saying something that people want to hear and maybe having an idea of doing it or working in some direction and straight up lying. Right. And they're just straight up lying. They just don't care and they don't even care if you know. Yeah. They just assume that you're an idiot. And I have a real problem with the American population because I do think we are becoming voluntarily stupid. And
we do need to steer it away from that direction.
Yeah. It's horrible because, again, you're just being manipulated and taken advantage of, and you don't even know because you're too distracted with TikTok and, whatever.
Yeah. Let's pick up the books again.
Yeah, you're worried. You're worried about your football team. You're worried about Republican, Democrat. You're not worried about America. You're not worried about what they're doing behind your back because you're distracted and confused. Yeah. And so this is why I do what I do. And I get a lot of 100%. I get a lot of flack for it, especially from super rah pro-Western people because they don't like to hear uncomfortable truths. Right. And I might not be right in everything I say. Right. But I do not lie. Yeah. I will never lie when I'm talking about this. I might make mistakes sometimes, but I will never lie. Yeah. Because I see no benefit in it. If I lie to you, eventually that lie is going to come back. Right. And you're not going to trust me. And I will just end up becoming the exact same thing that I hate. Right. So I have to tell the truth. I have to be brutally honest. And people might not like me for that. And I don't really care. That's fine. I'm going to say exactly what's on my mind. Yeah.
Well, I think that's important. Everybody go out and vote. We hope this gave you some clarity as to everything you've been hearing over the past few years.
Or no clarity on anything. Yeah. It's all just too much.
Yeah. Digest it. Like he said, do some research.
Yes, do your own research before you go and vote for anything. Yeah. Before you even commit to agreeing to some idea. Yeah. Go and educate yourself. If you're religious, make sure you go read your whole Bible. Exactly. If you're or Quran or Torah or whatever you are, make sure you fully understand what you're preaching. Yeah. Right. Whether it's economics, whether it's single issue voting like immigration or abortion or drug legalization or anything. Just make sure you're educated, because you're going to do damage to yourself and you're going to do damage to everything around you if you are going along with narratives and ideas that are just poison. Right. And you can see through that poison.
I think that's perfect way to sum it up. And that's exactly what we were trying to do with this video here, to give you guys some of that. So that way you are making a more informed decision. You're a little bit more educated. I know we all get busy. I know we all have, things we have to do, but we have to put in the work to stay and keep America in the way we want it and know it. And we hope everyone out there realizes it, and that you guys exercise that right to vote. But again, thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.
Don't forget to follow Scottson or Aiden on X.
Aiden on X. My Telegram, if you want to follow me on Telegram too, it's Calibrated. And then my YouTube channel is Calibrated with Scott.
Perfect. There you have it. We will put the links down below. Again, we appreciate it, guys. Like the video, share the video, of course, subscribe. It's not that hard to do. If you keep supporting, Julio G TV will keep growing, and we really appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
Thank you, man.
Thanks. I appreciate it, man. Until the next one, guys, peace.
Take care.